I feel a little odd about inserting myself into a program that I'm largely responsible for organizing. The reason, I promise you, is I originally had a much more interesting speaker for this slot who was unable to join us because of some health restrictions on travel. So since we had a hole in the program, and since I was working on something that seemed appropriate and fit into the program, and since I need a lot of help figuring out what I'm doing on this particular project, I decided to slot myself in and get your input and hopefully fix what I'm working on. So my topic is the question of obviousness, right? Patentable non-obviousness, non-patentable obviousness in the space that we're talking about, maybe a little bit bigger than the space that we're talking about. Really the sort of the wet sciences, right? You know, chemistry, biology, certainly biosimilars, but many of the cases and many of the decisions that bear on this question are going to be outside the biosimilar context itself. And the question that I'm concerned about or that I'm worried about here is how we ought to judge obviousness in those kinds of technologies, chemistry, biology, and so on. And as you can tell from the title of my talk, title of my paper, you can find at least two different approaches in patent law in the United States as it exists right now. One series of cases, one series of decisions I would characterize as focusing on the structure of molecules, right? And that was really the dominant approach that was developed for biologics, certainly through the late 1990s and into the early 2000s, which may now be in doubt. And I'll talk about that with you a little bit. The other approach, which might be an alternative or which might have replaced it, is thinking about the function of those molecules, right? So as Nicholson indicated a little bit in his talk, especially towards the end of the Q&A, patents worry us sometimes, right? You know, we consider them to be kind of a necessary evil. The usual story that we tell is that we give patents out as incentive to invest in new technologies, but we know that they're dangerous, right? They impede competition, they prevent access to technologies. So there's clearly a trade-off, right, between sort of creating incentives for investment and impeding use of the technology once it's been created. So we're very cautious about issuing them, right? We only want to give out patents because they're kind of socially and financially dangerous. We only want to give them out if we think we're getting a significant advance over the previous technology. And one of the legal standards that we use to do that, to calibrate that, is the obviousness requirement, right? We don't want to give a patent on something that people of skill in that technology would find obvious, because why should we give you a 20-year set of exclusive rights for something that could have easily been done by anyone, right? By anyone of ordinary skill in that particular area. So if we're talking about chemical or biological molecule obviousness, we talk about the expectation of success, right? Based on the literature, based on the prior art that's out there, what expectation of success would the person of ordinary skill have of achieving or obtaining the claimed invention? But the problem is we don't really know success of what, right? Is it success in finding or creating the particular structure that gets patented, right? Is that the expectation that we're talking about? Or are we talking about the expectation of finding a molecule with that particular function, right? And that's an important distinction, right? Because there may be multiple structures, multiple molecules with different structures that could perform the same function, right? You know, so you could have overlaps there. Another way of putting this, if you're kind of a patent geek, right, is in re duel still good law, right? And we'll talk about this case, but this is one of the cases that I mentioned a moment ago from the 1990s that seems to take the structural approach, and which has been thrown into some doubt, right? And every time I teach this in my patent class, talk about it with my students, look at the material on chemical and biological obviousness, I end up asking myself, although this case hasn't technically been overruled, I wonder, is it still good law or not? I think it's a particularly pressing or salient question to ask because of changes in technology. Right? If you've calibrated the granting of patents through obviousness to what is a significant move forward in a particular field, right? What is or is not obvious in a particular field, that's clearly going to change over time, right? And we want it to. As technology develops, the fictional person of ordinary skill in the art, who is our metric or our legal measure of what is not obvious, has access to more information, knows more, and different things, more things are going to be obvious than used to be. Brenda Simon has written about this a little bit in some of her work. And some people have argued that in the chemical and biosimilar space, everything is becoming obvious because of advances in technology, right? That we have high throughput synthesizers, we have ability to assess biological targets, we can certainly generate molecules of all sorts through automation at very high speeds, lots of structural variations, we can analyze those very quickly. And so we can generate lots of structures, we can predict what they're going to do, and maybe all of these structures are becoming obvious because of automation, and in particular the combination of machine learning and automation. Right? I'm not sure that that's right, but the question that I'm asking here bears on that particular inquiry. So I said, one way you could formulate this question, or one way you could ask this question, is say, is in re duel good law, right? And as I said, there are a couple of these cases, in re Bell, in re Duel, from the 1990s, decided by the United States Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit, which is the appellate court in the United States that essentially ends up deciding all patent matters. Congress wanted to create uniform national patent law, and they put it in the hands of this particular court. And strangely, for much of the late 20th and early 21st century, the law of biological molecules ended up in the hands of a particular judge, Judge Lurie, who seemed to end up writing all of the biotech patent cases. Still not clear how that happened, since the cases are supposed to be assigned randomly, but you sort of name a major biotech case from that period. It was probably written by Judge Lurie, who, interestingly enough, is a chemist, right? Sort of a classically trained small molecule chemist, and that's kind of important to the story and to the inquiry as I'm posing it. Right? So Bell and Duel both involve similar fact patterns, right? Where the prior art, right, the literature, already had information, already had disclosure of particular proteins, right, particular peptide sequences that had been sequenced using sort of classic biochemical techniques. And the question at the time was, okay, what gene or what nucleotide sequence is coding for those particular proteins? If you know the amino acid sequence, there are pretty standard laboratory techniques, even at the time these cases were decided, for taking that peptide information and using it to create probes and sort of working backwards to try and find the genes that were producing them. Now, given changes in the law, right, the actual patents at issue here probably wouldn't be good 101 subject matter now anyway, after the Myriad case. But it's not like we've totally done away with nucleotide patents. So they're still relevant in that sense. And they're certainly relevant for what the court said about obviousness. Because the patent office said, you can't get patents on the nucleotide sequences that are coding for these gene products because you already had the amino acid sequence, and it's routine to work backwards from the amino acid sequence in order to get the nucleotide. As I said, using pretty standard and conventional laboratory techniques. This went to the Federal Circuit, ended up in the hands of Judge Lurie twice. Each of these cases was decided by Lurie, or at least written by Lurie. And he said, well, there's degeneracy or redundancy in the genetic code. So there's something like 10 to the 36th possible molecules that could code for these known proteins, for these peptides. So it's not obvious which one of them it was until the actual work was done to find out where these proteins came from, right? To find out the particular nucleotide sequence out of the 10 to the 36th possibilities that the patent ends up claiming. And I should probably disclose here that I'm at least partially responsible for the 10 to the 36th argument. That was an argument that my firm developed. My colleague at the time at Morrison & Foerster, Deborah Shetka, I believe, first originated this, and we kind of talked it through. And Judge Lurie liked this. Now, we figured that Judge Lurie would like this, right? Because, as I said, he was a chemist, sort of a small molecule, classically trained chemist. And this relies pretty heavily on classic chemistry obviousness doctrine, right? Cases from the earlier 20th century dealing with small molecules, right? He said, yes, it's true that the methodology to find the structure, the particular nucleotide structure, is available, and you know what the function of that structure is going to be, right? It's going to code for this particular gene product, but you don't know in advance what the structure is going to be, and so until you find it, it can't be obvious, right? It's sort of in this very large universe of possible molecules. Now, as I said, that set of decisions, right, has been thrown somewhat into doubt by a couple of more recent decisions, right? The United States Supreme Court, in an obviousness decision, KSR versus Teleflex, looking at a sort of electromechanical device, right? This was a type of pedal for an automobile, right? For brakes or accelerators. So it was a very different type of technology, but the Federal Circuit had said that this particular design of an automobile pedal was not obvious. And the Supreme Court, kind of reining in some freewheeling obviousness cases from the Federal Circuit, said no, this is definitely obvious, right? Because the Federal Circuit had gotten in the habit of saying, well, number one, before we're going to say something is obvious, we want a really clear indication in the literature, in the prior art, that the person of ordinary skill would have come up with this, right? We want a very explicit teaching, suggestion, or motivation that the fauceta, or perhaps it's the faucita, I'm not sure, the person having ordinary skill in the art, that person would have come up with this. And yes, for this automobile pedal with a particular kind of electronic sensor, it might have been obvious to try that, but but we don't know if the person of ordinary skill would have succeeded in trying to design that. Because obvious to try is not the same as obvious, as legal obvious. And the Supreme Court, sort of seized on that catchphrase that the Federal Circuit had, that, something's not obvious if it's obvious to give it a try, and said that's really not a good way to think about obviousness here. And they cited to In Re Duel, where that quote was quoted, as the citation for the Federal Circuit's obvious to try catchphrase, and said no, you shouldn't think about obviousness in that particular way. The Federal Circuit subsequently took a case in Ray Cuban, which in some ways is a lot like Duel or Bell, right? Again, it's a situation where you've got a known peptide in the literature, and you're trying to locate the gene, the nucleotide sequence that codes for that. And an opinion written by Judge Rader of the Federal Circuit said, we think this means that in re Duel is no longer good law. The Supreme Court kind of dissed it, said it was kind of a bad thing in this citation, and essentially came to a decision that was the inverse, right? The reverse of Duel. Said, no, if you've got the methodology and you've got routine laboratory techniques for finding something, that makes it obvious. It's obvious to try, could be obvious. Now, interesting because Judge Rader had never liked Judge Lurie's structural obviousness cases, right? And they'd had sort of fights about this for a long time. And so in some sense, Judge Rader here kind of seized on the Supreme Court citation and got the upper hand and came to a different outcome than Lurie's cases, right? So as I said, that throws Duel into some degree of doubt. But if you look at where Lurie got the doctrine in Duel and where the obvious to try standard comes from, as I mentioned, it goes back pretty far in classic or kind of small molecule organic chemistry, right? To something that was called the Papish Revolution, because it was sort of such a big upset back in the early 20th century. And the Papish case and the line of cases that culminated in Papish dealt with families of small molecules, right? So chemicals come in families, and frequently, this family of molecules, they're going to have pretty much the same characteristics. And when you change them in predictable ways or in certain ways, you're going to get another in that family, right? So I've got methane, it's got one carbon, it's a gas, it's flammable, it's highly volatile, it explodes. I put another carbon on it, I get ethane, put another carbon on it, I get propane, right? You can keep extending the chain and you get a family of chemicals with pretty much the same kinds of characteristics. So the patent law grew up that, a predictable extension of a known small molecule is going to be obvious, right? You put one more carbon or one more oxygen, one more alcohol group on it, and you pretty much know it's going to be part of the family and you know what its characteristics are going to be. But in Papish, they said, that works fine on paper, right? Sort of if you're drawing structures in 2 dimensions. But these structures have 3-dimensional attributes, right? They're sort of oriented in space. And sometimes you put, one more group on and you get something unexpected, right? Because it's not sort of just a flat 2-dimensional extension of one more carbon, one more alcohol group, but it actually does something interesting because it's oriented in space. So if you make a predictable change and you get unexpected results, right? You get an unpredictable characteristic, that should be non-obvious, right? That's kind of a surprise, right? So surprising outcome of a predictable change should be patentable. And that's really where Lurie was looking when he decided Duel, right? That's where this obvious to try phrase comes from. Yeah, it's obvious to put one more carbon or one more alcohol group on the molecule, but that doesn't mean the outcome is going to be obvious. It could have unexpected or surprising characteristics. Notice that that's, in essence, the reverse, though, of how Judge Lurie used obvious to try in Duel, right? So in the Papish line of cases, you're making a expected or known or obvious structural change, and you get an unexpected function, right? Judge Lurie in Duel turns that around and says, well, we know what the function is, but we don't know what molecule is going to perform that function, right? So in some sense, Duel is the inverse or inverted version of the Papish cases. But then obvious to try became, as I said, a catchphrase in the Federal Circuit, got used in lots of other kinds of technologies outside of the wet sciences, and became kind of an excuse for the Federal Circuit to say that pretty much everything is non-obvious and you can get a patent on almost anything, even because obvious to try is not the same as obvious. And that's really what the Supreme Court was objecting to in the KSR case. The other thing to be aware of here when we're trying to figure out whether Duel is still good law and whether we should focus on structure or on function is a second line of related cases that were also decided by the Federal Circuit and mostly written by Judge Lurie during the same period of time, dealing with patentable disclosure, right? With the Section 112 requirements for enablement and for written description. Right? And these are, as I say, related cases because, again, you're talking about people at the time who are finding macromolecule sequences, particularly nucleotide sequences, disclosing them as is required in the patent application and in the published patent, and then trying to claim families of homologous macromolecules, right? Nucleotide sequences. And there, Judge Lurie said, well, you know, you can't claim every molecule in a family if you only have possession of, or if you've only disclosed one example, right? So in one of these cases involving the University of California, as a matter of fact, you know, the researchers discovered the nucleotide sequence, the gene that codes for rat insulin, right? You know, in rats, and we know that mammals have, you know, like 99% or greater homology among their genes. So having sequenced and found the rat gene, they then claimed all mammalian genes, because of course the one you really want is humans, so you can make artificial insulin, right? You know, synthetic insulin. That's the big market. There's not a huge market for diabetic rat treatments. So you know, but so having found rats and knowing that we now know pretty much what the other mammals or insulin genes are going to look like, they claimed all of them. Judge Lurie said, not so fast, you can't do that, right? Because you don't know what these other molecules are going to look like exactly. Notice that this is, again, kind of the reciprocal of what he did, what he said in Bell and Duel and those obviousness cases, right? If the prior art doesn't tell you what the structure is going to be, right? You don't know till you've found it. Then the same is true for patentable disclosure, right? If you've disclosed only one example of a particular family of molecules, then you don't know exactly what the other ones are going to be, and you can't claim them yet. And the linchpin for this was the patent doctrine of conception, right? You know, when you're an inventor, you have this mental understanding or image of the invention, right? And the Federal Circuit, again, written by Judge Lurie, decided a number of cases saying, in order to conceive of a biological invention, biomolecule, you've got to know the structure, right? You've got to have a mental understanding of the structure. And it said, you know, in the obviousness cases, the prior art doesn't give you that structure. Right? So you can think of that as being what I would call constructive conception in the prior art, right? The prior art doesn't have that degree of detail. In the disclosure cases and the 112 cases said the disclosure that you've given us in your patent doesn't have that degree of detail, right? Again, it's about the structure. So in some sense, these were reciprocal related lines of cases. You know, what you have to disclose in a patent versus what has been disclosed in the prior art. In the one case for 112 purposes, in the other case for obviousness. Judge Rader didn't like those cases either, but he lost this one, right? So the Federal Circuit, in an en banc opinion, the Ariat opinion, sort of confirmed that yes, this is the law for Section 112. Judge Rader, you know, screamed and yelled about that a little bit, and but you know, so he kind of got a win on the structure in obviousness, but he lost on the question of structure in disclosure. So that leaves us in a little bit of a quandary, or at least leaves me a little bit of a quandary, right? Duel hasn't been actually overruled, right? It was sort of cited with some degree of disdain, perhaps by the Supreme Court. Judge Rader seized on it in Cuban as no longer being good law due to that. But the reciprocal or complementary line of cases dealing with disclosure in Section 112 is still good law and has in fact been affirmed by an en banc opinion of the Federal Circuit. And it's kind of hard to think of getting rid of the one and keeping the other, right? They kind of would seem to travel as a pair. So you know, what does that leave us to think about structure as the basis for obviousness or non-obviousness with regard to biosimilars and other biological molecules? I guess, you know, as a starter, you would have to distinguish the KSR, which I don't think is hard to do, right? As I've already indicated, what the Supreme Court said about structure and in re dual and obvious to try in KSR was kind of a throwaway, right? It's like, we need a citation, we'll use in re dual. Judge Rader seemed to put much more emphasis on that than the Supreme Court did. You could also distinguish KSR by saying, well, this has to do with mechanical or predictable kinds of inventions, and the Federal Circuit has long said that the wet sciences are less predictable, particularly when you get to biology. So maybe what applies to automobile pedals doesn't apply very well to biosimilars or to other kinds of biological molecules. What about Kuban, right? Where Judge Rader says, yeah, based on KSR, we think Duel and Bell are definitely no longer good law. Number one, you could distinguish it factually. There's some pretty good writing. Kevin Noonan, for example, some others have indicated that it looks like the panel there probably didn't really understand the facts, right? That the prior art literature actually wouldn't disclose or lead you to the particular molecule. So maybe it's factually distinguishable. There's also some precedential question, right? Because one panel of a Federal Circuit can't overrule another panel. All right, you can overrule en banc, or you can, the same panel can overrule itself. So technically, you just have differing opinions, and one of the judges is now gone. Right? Judge Rader's no longer in the court. So it might not be that hard to distinguish Kuban if you think that that's a problem. Kuban talks about another case, in re O'Farrell, an older case dealing with obviousness, that says, well, it's true that obvious to try doesn't necessarily mean obvious if you are either just sort of randomly combining things until you get something that works, right? If there's not guidance, then that's not obviousness. Or if you're just exploring a new technology. And if you think about those examples, right, they actually square up pretty well with the in re Papish small molecule cases I talked about. So you could, based on O'Farrell, which is cited with approval in these other cases, come to the conclusion that, yeah, Papish is still good law, and so maybe Duel is still good law as well, right? And again, it depends on what you think is the definition of success, right? Expectation of success to find the particular function, maybe not. Expectation to find the particular structure, that might make more sense, right? So at the end of the day, I think I'm tentatively of the mind that Bell and Duel probably are, or at least should still be good law, which would get us out of some binds or some problems that we're going to have with these types of automated synthesis and exploration of technology. And so I'm going to stop there and let some of you set me straight with some comments and some discussion. Thank you. All right, Nicholson, right off the bat.
I just want to, like you ended on the tantalizing bit.
Okay, which is?
Why? Why does, if we say, yeah, sure, Duel has not been disapproved, Duel's still good law.
Yeah.
But the issues about mechanistic synthesis with like AI rocking the 3D, now we can actually envision all these molecules, we can do a pretty good job predicting their function because we've got great machine learning and it's going to figure it all out. But Duel cuts that knot, and in which way does it cut the knot?
So I think it cuts the knot because being able to generate a molecule, right? Being able, number one, doesn't mean that you necessarily know the structure in advance. And even if you know the structure in advance, right? Papish tells us you may or may not get something that is obvious or predictable, right? For example, Ryan Abbott has this paper, which is probably what you and I are both thinking about, right? It says, well, we can generate all these molecules, and the fact that we just sort of generate molecules makes them obvious, right? Well, we have a doctrine called simultaneous conception and reduction to practice, which says, no, actually, until I see the molecule, know what it does, and it's sort of in the mind of the inventor, you don't have something that is an invention, right? And that's part of what Lurie relies on back in re Duel.
Know what it does?
Yeah.
If I make a thing, I don't destroy novelty just by having made the thing, and like here it is out in the world. I've generated this widget, no idea what it does, but there it is. That doesn't destroy novelty.
Okay, well, so two separate questions, right? So I answered the obviousness question. On the novelty question, right, now you're depending on inherency, right? And it's not clear to me that unless it gives something to the world, quote unquote, right, Tillman versus Proctor, that destroys novelty either. Okay. But that's the direction that I'm thinking, is sort of how to deal with that quandary, and the first thing that you think of when you see this type of automated synthesis, I had somebody say this to me actually at a conference 2 weeks ago, says, yeah, I read Abbott's paper and isn't it just obvious to try? And I said, yes, but that means we have to deal with the obvious to try question that's sort of left over from KSR and from Kuban. Does that make sense?
Sure.
Okay, we'll talk about it more. Timo, please.
To me, it seems also this is very close to the Farrell line of case law, the older case law that we see now. This reasonable, obvious to try with a reasonable expectation of success,
Right.
Which was very close to the process that the Europeans have applied all along the way. Right?
Well, so there are all kinds of, comparative variations that we can do here, and some of the things that are going on in Europe are more sensible, and some of them are probably less. But I think, yeah.
So
I mean, part of the problem is we don't have any type of purposive limitation in the U.S. But yeah.
So there's some interesting papers in Europe by the late Judge Leddy, for example, Leddy,
Yeah.
in the UK,
Mm-hmm.
who has written a paper on innovation, what has patent law got to do with it, and there he asked this question that patent law to some extent has become a victim of its own success,
Right.
and because the risk, and that has also been acknowledged by Ben Royal, for example, is that due to this obvious try with the reasonable expectation of success doctrine, and with the explosion of prior art, which is now being amplified by AI
Yeah.
and by transparency regulations,
Right.
clinical trials data transparency in both the US and Europe, that this has led to an avalanche of prior art and common general knowledge, which kills a lot of patents, which are then discarded from the innovation process by companies. Many European judges have acknowledged that this might be a problem, and in terms of how to build bridges over these gaps. I mean, if molecules are discarded because you see
Yeah.
they can't be patented, is of course a task for the future, because patent law is concerned about invention, not necessarily innovation, right? I mean, if you
I'm not sure I believe that, but yeah.
Yes, you could discuss
Yeah.
that. I mean, it should
Yeah.
be kind of,
Yeah. But you're absolutely right. I mean, building the bridge is part. This is a stone in the bridge, right?
Yes.
That's part of the way to do it.
how would you go about? Would you extend it more flexible regulatory rules because under the TRIPS agreement they're more flexible than patent doctrine, or would you try to kind of lower the threshold for an obvious requirement?
So some of each, right? I mean, this goes to Nicholson's question, right? Because at least under U.S. law, if you have in the prior art either the structure or the function, that's enough to enable and create anticipation, right? If you don't swallow that hook, line, and sinker, right? For example, if you're on IP profs, there was a discussion about this a while back where Rochelle Dreyfus said, I don't think that's the law, and if it is the law, it probably shouldn't be for the reasons you're indicating. That might be a fruitful direction to look at. And I hadn't looked at the paper by Laddie. I think I was too busy reading his stuff about doctrine of equivalence. But I should have a look at that. Okay. Brenda, yeah.
So, interesting discussion and talk. I guess I'm just, as you were talking, I was just thinking more about kind of the technological advances that seem to bear on these questions and where you think in the future, will there even be much of an obviousness discussion to the extent you see Alphabet's recent machine learning example that works through protein folding, which, forget about, 10 to the 36, try, 10 to the 146, right, to try and figure out how a particular protein folds. And then you have these machine learning techniques that basically enable this understanding, right? So do you think that this will be kind of a less of an issue going forward to the extent that technological advance answers these structural questions that we're having difficulty with now?
So again, to kind of extend my response to Nicholson, I mean, I think where you have to end up with this is, I now have these advanced tools, right, that I can use to figure out what does this macromolecule do, right, or how does this macromolecule work. If you think that simply having that ability is going to negate patentability, right, then you have the problems that Timo just asked about. As I indicated, I think the answer to that is, it's like using any other investigative tool, whether it's a microscope or a HPLC column or whatever it is, right? I sort of use the AI to figure out how the protein folds, how it works, and as soon as that gets into the mind of the inventor, then you have invention, right? Just the fact that the information is out there. shouldn't negate that, right? So I think that's the direction we have to go, right? Is you have to sort of not get too Twitter-pated about the technological change, but focus where we've always focused, which is what's the human doing and what are the incentives for the human, right? And it's what you do with the information once you get it, which might be what Timo was talking about in terms of invention versus innovation, right? But I think that's something like that is where we have to end up. If that makes sense. Yeah. Jake.
So, just as a comment, I was particularly fascinated.
By the way, I'm hoping this kind of interfaces with your presentation this afternoon.
Yes,
Yeah.
it will. Where
Good.
I'll be talking about a written description for some of the antibody claims.
Yeah, exactly.
Especially after this Amgen versus Sanofi case,
Yeah.
which will set the world on fire. Anyway, I was particularly fascinated at the notion that a lot of this obvious to try divide, at least historically, comes from the split between kind of chemistry and biology. It's the first, at least, that I have heard of that as being the origin of this. And I'd like actually to propose another one, and I'd like some, comment.
Another split or another, yeah.
Another historical genesis for
okay.
the reason that we're having difficulty in this particular area with respect to obvious to try, right? That there is a disconnect in patent law between not knowing something and yet at the same time having a pretty clear roadmap as to exactly what you need to do to figure out what you don't know.
Yeah.
Versus the standard in patent law, whereas if you don't know, you don't know, you don't know, and we don't care that the path forward is clear, it still nonetheless may, it's not, if you try to patent too early, right, then fallen patents could be obvious, or the earlier patent could be non-enabling. Providing in the biological context with a plan saying, I don't necessarily know if this particular molecule is going to have a particular function, or at least in particular, let's say, therapeutic function. But if we wanted to figure it out, here's what we would do. We do some codon optimization, right? We do some solubility stuff. We do some humanizing, but there's a checklist.
Right.
And I'm just curious if you think that this is one of the kind of interesting disconnects between scientific practice and thought versus patent practice. I just didn't know if you thought that was also an origin of something.
Yeah. So yes and no, right? I mean the parallel lines of cases, one of which survives through Ariad and one of which maybe doesn't, right? At the time they were being decided, Don Chisholm's summary was, you don't got it till you got it. But once you got it, right? Which is also a summary of what you're saying. So yeah, there's a policy question here, right? Which is, how much of a carrot do we need to dangle to get investment and to get innovation, right? Versus how early do we want people to be patenting, right? We don't want people patenting too far upstream. We want to kind of wait until the technology is matured enough so that we're not tying up fundamental information or fundamental discoveries, right? I think you just heard from the conversation, the questions over here, that sweet spot is changing, right? As part of Brenda's question too, right? I'm actually a little bit less concerned about how far upstream do you need to be than I am about the incentive part, right? Because the stream is getting very short, right? So now we use automation, we use AI, and there's very little daylight between fundamental research and applied products, right? So if that's collapsed, I kind of don't care, right? I'm actually much more concerned about how do we get the incentives to now do the innovation, right? Sort of get this thing to market. And I think that the tools are actually there to do that, right? To build the bridge, like simultaneous conception reduction to practice, like structural obviousness. If we'll use them, but there are some impediments from these past cases. So so I agree with you. I don't know that is different necessarily than the obvious to try, not obvious to try discussion, but it's a component. Yeah. Other thoughts? Yeah. Follow up from Timo. Yeah.
I'm happy that you kind of felt a little misunderstood. Of course, patents are important innovation.
Yeah.
They are basically, that was my point, right? They're mostly concerned about protecting inventions under the patent criteria.
Right.
That means that sometimes innovation is not achieved because products are discarded.
Right.
which are not inventive enough, but which would be innovation in the end.
Yeah, and I think what I'm saying is that we might need to focus more on innovation, right?
Yes.
On getting things to marketplace. Yeah.